What if I told you that history's most brutal dictators didn't rise to power through violence, but through paychecks? That's right. Before the tanks rolled and the flags waved, there was something far more dangerous at work. Something quiet. Something most people actually begged for. If you're ready to dig deeper into the money secrets that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button right now. Because on Monetary Archaeologist, we uncover the financial truths buried beneath every major historical event. Now, let's talk about how entire nations sold their freedom for a job. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Fascism wasn't forced on people. It was chosen, voted for, celebrated in the streets. Why? Because when you're starving, when your children are crying, when your entire life savings can't buy a loaf of bread, you stop caring about freedom. You care about survival. And that's exactly what the dictators understood. Think about it. When you picture Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, what comes to mind? Probably goose-stepping soldiers, angry speeches, violence in the streets. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people living under these regimes weren't terrified. They were grateful. Grateful for what? Jobs, stability, a sense that finally someone had a plan. The masterminds behind fascism discovered something brilliant and terrifying. You don't need guns to control people when you control their income. Let me take you back to where this all started. Picture Europe in the 1920s. The First World War just ended. Millions dead. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Economies completely destroyed. In Germany, people were using money as wallpaper, literally. Hyperinflation got so bad that a wheelbarrow full of cash couldn't buy dinner. Workers would rush to spend their paychecks during lunch breaks because by the afternoon, the money would be worthless. In Italy, soldiers who survived the war came home to nothing. No jobs waiting, no pensions, no gratitude, just unemployment lines that stretched for blocks. These weren't weak countries before the war. Germany was an industrial powerhouse. Italy had a rich cultural heritage. But now, both were on their knees. And the new democratic governments? They had no answers. Just arguments, committees, and empty promises. People were desperate, not for speeches, not for ideals, for food, for work, for something, anything that felt stable. Then 1929 hit. The Great Depression crashed into Europe like a second war. Banks collapsed overnight. Factories shut down. Unemployment shot past 30% in most major cities. Imagine this. You wake up one morning and 1 out of every 3 people you know has no job, no income, no hope. Fathers who'd worked their entire lives suddenly had nothing to do but stand in bread lines. Families burned their furniture to stay warm because they couldn't afford coal. In Berlin, people were selling everything they owned just to eat. In Rome, entire neighborhoods descended into chaos. Democracy, still young, still learning, had no playbook for this. And into that desperate silence walked a new kind of politician. They didn't promise freedom or rights or debate. They promised something simpler. Order. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. Different countries, different backgrounds, but the exact same pitch. Give us total control, and we'll give you back your lives. And you know what? Millions of people said yes. Let's start with Germany. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, the country was a disaster. 6 million people unemployed, factories silent, investors fled. The future looked hopeless. But then something incredible happened. Within just 3 years, unemployment almost completely disappeared. Think about that. 3 years, from total collapse to what looked like full employment. People called it the German economic miracle. New highways stretched across the countryside. Massive stadiums rose from nothing. Factories that had been dead for years roared back to life. The government even promised every German family an affordable car, the Volkswagen, the people's car. To ordinary citizens, it felt like magic, like their country had been reborn. The rest of the world watched in amazement. How did Hitler do it? What was his secret? Here's the truth. He cheated. But it was such clever cheating that hardly anyone noticed until it was too late. The Nazis didn't actually find money to fund all this. They invented it. They created something called Mefo Bills, basically IOUs on steroids. These were secret promissory notes that let the government spend billions without showing it in official budgets. Here's how it worked. The government would order a company to build, say, a highway. Instead of paying with real money, they'd give the company these Mefo Bills. The bills were basically promises that said, "We'll pay you back later once Germany is strong again." Companies were forced to accept them. Banks were forced to honor them. And the whole scheme stayed hidden from international observers. On paper, Germany looked financially responsible. In reality, they were printing fake money and calling it an economic recovery. But here's the truly devious part. It worked, at least for a while. Those highways they built, they weren't just roads. They were military transport routes designed to move tanks and troops quickly during war. Those factories making Volkswagens, with a few adjustments, they could produce military vehicles in weeks. That jobs miracle everyone celebrated, it was a rearmament program disguised as economic recovery. Every single job was connected to preparing for war. The Nazis weren't rebuilding Germany's economy, they were building Germany's war machine, and millions of grateful workers were helping them do it. Because here's what made the system so psychologically powerful. People didn't feel oppressed, they felt employed. They weren't forced into loyalty, they were paid for it. And when your paycheck depends entirely on the government, speaking out becomes impossible. Because losing your job doesn't just mean inconvenience, it means your family starves. Freedom becomes a luxury you can't afford. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini was running his own version of the con. He called his system the corporate state, a fancy name for total control dressed up as cooperation. Mussolini's pitch was brilliant. He said, "Look, capitalism creates inequality and chaos. Communism destroys individual achievement. But what if there was a third option?" He promised a system where workers, business owners, and the government would all work together for the national good. Everybody wins, right? On paper, it sounded almost reasonable. In reality, it was a trap. Mussolini abolished independent labor unions and replaced them with state-controlled syndicates. Workers couldn't negotiate their own wages anymore. The government decided what everyone earned. Prices were fixed. Production quotas were mandated. Private businesses technically still existed, but they couldn't make any major decisions without government approval. Every industry had to report to the fascist party. Every contract went through party bureaucrats. Step out of line and your business disappeared overnight. But the propaganda machine sold it as efficiency. Mussolini made the trains run on time, people said. That phrase spread around the world as proof that fascism worked. Except it was mostly a lie. Italy's trains weren't running significantly better. Mussolini's government just controlled the media that reported on them. Behind the propaganda, the real numbers told a different story. Productivity wasn't increasing, it was stagnating. Italy was importing more than it produced. National debt was exploding. All those public works projects Mussolini loved, draining swamps, building monuments, creating jobs for the Cameras, they cost far more than Italy could actually afford. To keep the illusion alive, Mussolini's government did what every failing regime does. They manipulated the statistics and borrowed money they'd never be able to repay. Italy's miracle wasn't economic growth, it was branding, marketing, a carefully constructed image sold to both citizens and the world.
Like a bankrupt company faking profits to fool investors, the fascist state inflated its image until reality could no longer be hidden. Then there was Spain. Francisco Franco took power after a vicious civil war that tore the country apart. His solution? Isolation. Franco declared that Spain would achieve autarky, complete economic self-sufficiency. Spain would rely on no other nation, no imports, no foreign influence, just pure Spanish strength. It sounded patriotic, it sounded strong. It was a disaster. Spain sealed its borders to trade. Industries were nationalized. Everything from food to fuel was rationed by the government. If you wanted a job, you needed connections to the regime. If you wanted a loan, you needed to prove your loyalty. Even getting housing required showing you were on the right side. The official economy basically stopped functioning. The black market became the only real market. Productivity collapsed. Famine spread. Spain fell decades behind the rest of Europe. And yet, Franco stayed in power for nearly 40 years. How? Because even when the economy failed completely, the control mechanism worked perfectly. Citizens learned that survival meant obedience, that keeping your head down was safer than speaking up, that the state might be inefficient, but opposing it was suicide. Franco turned scarcity itself into a weapon of control. Germany, Italy, Spain. Different leaders, different propaganda, different flavors of fascism, but the exact same formula. Create economic dependency, control employment, make survival dependent on loyalty. These regimes didn't just rebuild economies, they rewired human behavior. They created societies where having a job meant you were loyal.
Being productive meant you were patriotic. Dissenting meant you were unemployed. And unemployed meant you were starving. Economic dependence became the quiet weapon that made the loud weapons unnecessary. By the late 1930s, the illusion had reached its peak. Unemployment was nearly gone. Factories were busy. National pride was everywhere. On the surface, fascism looked like it had solved capitalism's chaos. But it hadn't solved anything. It had just converted one problem into another. The invisible hand of the free market had been replaced by the iron fist of the state. Every factory, every farm, every paycheck had become part of one giant equation. Obedience equals survival. And here's the truly brilliant and terrifying part. This was more effective than violence. Fear can control people for a while, but fear also builds resentment. It creates resistance. Eventually, people fight back against fear. But dependency lasts forever. A worker who depends on the state for survival doesn't revolt. He complies. He votes the right way. He salutes. He reports his neighbors. Not because soldiers forced him, because his children need to eat. That's the real genius of fascist economics. It made control invisible. The system ran on three simple levers. First, jobs as morality. Work makes you free, the Nazi slogan said. Labor wasn't just a way to earn money. It was your patriotic duty, your contribution to national greatness. If you had a job, you were a good citizen. If you didn't, well, what was wrong with you? Second, debt is fuel. Public works, military expansion, subsidies, all of it gave the appearance of prosperity, but none of the money was real. It was borrowed, printed, or hidden behind accounting tricks that would make modern bankers blush. The regimes were spending tomorrow's wealth to buy today's loyalty. Third, propaganda as reality. Every economic policy was wrapped in the language of destiny and pride. The state wasn't buying your silence. It was offering you a chance to be part of something historic. You weren't just a factory worker. You were rebuilding national greatness. You weren't just following orders. You were shaping the future. And when people believe they're part of a grand story, they don't notice the chains being locked around their wrists. The myth of the miracle. Let's be clear about something. The Nazi economic miracle is still remembered today as proof that their system worked. It didn't. Yes, unemployment dropped dramatically, but wages stagnated. Prices rose. Workers lost all bargaining power. Independent unions were destroyed. Strikes became treason. Real income fell. But propaganda told people they were richer than ever. They had jobs, didn't they? They had subsidized vacations through state programs. They had cheap radios. They had national pride. The program was called Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy. It was entertainment as anesthesia, distraction as control. Give people just enough comfort to keep them quiet, just enough pride to keep them compliant. In Italy, the pattern was identical. Mussolini claimed to have unido labore e capitale su bandeiro patriótico. Em realidade, ele reemplaçou competição com cotas e escolha com complacência. Every worker belonged a uma guilda estatal onde as horas, deveres e dútias eram ditadas de cima. O mercado estava morto. O Estado havia consumido inteiramente. E quando a guerra finalmente came, essa maquinária de obediência se transferiu sem fricção em overdrive. Workers não precisavam ser convencidos para construir armas. Eles já haviam sido treinados a ver produção em si como virtude. That's how you build an army before firing a single shot, by tornando a inteira economia em uma longa assembleia de lealdade. The lesson we forgot. Now here's where this story gets really uncomfortable. Porque as economias de controle não morreram em 1945. Elas evoluíram. Modern governments learn the same lesson. Você pode comprar estabilidade com jobs e crédito longo antes de precisar de força. Os métodos mudaram, os uniformes desapareceram, mas o princípio permaneceu. Quando o anemprego cresce, quando unrest surgem, a solução é sempre a mesma. Massivos gastos públicos, infraestrutura projetos, estímulos pacotes, campanhas patrióticas incentivando cidadãos a comprar local e suportar a nação. Sound familiar? A mensagem é sempre a mesma. Work is dignity. Production is patriotism. The state is stability. No dictator required. Just um sistema que troca longo prazo por curto prazo financeiro, um pagamento de cada vez. Hoje, a relação entre governos e cidadãos parece menos parceria e mais emprego. A mesma dependência os fascistas engenharam por propaganda é agora construída através de dívidas, subsídios e política monetária. Quando sua morada depende de juros controlados por bancos centrais, quando seus espólios são destruídos por inflação que você não tem controle,
when your income depends on industries propped up by government contracts. How free are you, really? You don't need censura quando o complemento é profitável. The modern machinery. Look around the world today. Governments are rediscovering the old tools, just with better packaging. When industries fail, the state steps in with rescue packages. When growth stalls, central banks print money to fund jobs and subsidies. Citizens cheer because stability feels good. But just like the 1930s, it's not real wealth being created. It's debt being recycled. It's tomorrow's crisis being delayed with today's printing press. Jobs are no longer expressions of freedom. They're extensions of policy. Entire industries now survive not because they're competitive, but because they're politically useful. Defense, energy, surveillance, infrastructure. When the state becomes the employer, the investor, and the regulator all at once, the economy stops being a system. It becomes a hierarchy. And hierarchies don't reward freedom.
They reward obedience. What fascism really taught us. That's what the fascist regimes understood, and what we risk forgetting. You don't need to control speech if you control income. You don't need to suppress rebellion if everyone's too indebted to risk it. The lesson isn't just about history. It's about human nature. People don't fall for dictators because they love tyranny. They fall for the illusion of safety. When economies collapse, people will trade anything for stability, their savings, their rights, their voices. That's why fascism worked. It didn't sell ideology. It sold insurance. And the premium was freedom. The invisible bond. The same emotional mechanism powers the world's largest economies today. Governments promise protection from volatility. Markets expect rescue at every crash. Citizens demand jobs, not reform. Debt grows. Productivity stalls. And the illusion of prosperity continues as long as everyone believes. That belief is the invisible bond holding the modern world together. Not gold, not oil, not even currency. Just belief that the system will keep paying, that the state will keep printing, that someone, somewhere, is still in control. But history warns us what happens when that belief breaks. When the state becomes the economy, and the economy becomes the state, there's no one left to tell the truth. The line between policy and propaganda disappears. The numbers stop reflecting reality. And sooner or later, the bills come due, just like they did in 1939. The warning. Fascism didn't start with violence. It started with budgets. It began with a promise that government could end chaos through jobs, loans, and public works. And for a time, it delivered. The trains ran, the factories hummed, the flags waved, until the money ran out, until the debt-fueled order needed something novel to consume: land, resources, nations, lives. The final stage of fascist economics wasn't stability, it was expansion, war. When there was nothing left to borrow, the regimes borrowed lives. That's how economic control became global catastrophe. The choice we face. The warning is simple, but it never gets old. When the promise of security becomes permanent policy, freedom becomes temporaria. Every empire that bought loyalty with jobs eventually paid for it with blood. And every democracy that forgets how fascism funded itself risks repeating its methods, quietly, bureaucratically, debt by debt, paycheck by paycheck. Because economic control doesn't always march in uniform. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit, smiling, promising growth, and offering you a job. And by the time you realize what it cost, the freedom you traded is already gone. So the question isn't whether this could happen again. The question is it already happening? Are we trading freedom for paychecks without even realizing it? Are we so dependent on the system that we've forgotten what independence even means? These are the questions we dig up here on Monetary Archaeologist. If this changed how you see economics and power, hit that subscribe button, because the financial secrets that shaped history are still shaping your life today, and I'm going to keep digging them up, one story at a time. I'll see you in the next excavation.